Let's talk about The Two Towers by J.R.R. Tolkien, the second book in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Originally it was written as one big book, subdivided into volumes, and so in a sense it's just part two of a bigger book. I'll do what I normally do with kind of multi-book series, rather than what might be easier for Lord of the Rings and just pretend, everyone knows what's going on, so let's just go with it. Most of us have a passing familiarity at least. However, I think it'll still be useful to do a completely non-spoiler kind of very short summary of what I thought of this, and then go into a discussion which will spoiler lightly Fellowship of the Ring, in the sense it will refer to things there and assume people know what's going on. If you've read the books, or more to the point, seen the movies, that won't really be a problem for you. If you've seen the movies, you're not being spoiled of much by hearing about stuff in the books as well. So, what's the general summary? Well, this is my favourite book as a whole, Lord of the Rings, and this is, I'd say in general it's a near perfect book, and Two Towers continues that trend. It's very, very good. It moves subgenre within epic fantasy. It moves from a sort of vast scope. Initially, so basically, Fellowship is first half is entry into fantasy world. The second half is a big quest fantasy. Here you have a more political and military section, and you have a more intimate quest fantasy section, and they're both very good. They're both very well achieved. They are very differently paced, and some people don't like that as much. Some people really do like that. The character work is very, very good, and the kind of continued world building and engagement with the stakes for this world continue to be excellent, and generally speaking the style is very, very good. So would I recommend it? Yes. Simple answer. To go into a bit more detail then, as I say, this is a book of two halves, and it's quite different in terms of what's going on in terms of the two sub-books, because each of the three volumes is divided into two books. Fellowship, book one is up to Rivendell, and a very large part of that is in the, especially if you include concerning hobbits, the prologue. It's in the Shire. In fact, you're talking about the prologue and 5 chapters being about hobbits or in the Shire. 3 are with Tom Bombadil, and then there's 4 remaining ones from Bree to Rivendell. So you've got this big, deep focus on the characters, the stakes for the Shire, and that the world from the perspective of those entering into the fantasy land. For them, of course, the Shire is functionally just our world. Is a way in which Tolkien sets up Fellowship as a portal fantasy in that sense. A world with basically nothing supernatural in it, other than there's this wizard who turns up sometimes with fireworks, and then they go out into the wide world. Book 2 chronologically follows on in Fellowship and goes from a fairly long section at Rivendell through to the breaking of the Fellowship at Amon Hen. And so you have a kind of chronological continuation, big portal section, and the first threshold stuff in the Old Forest Classic Heroes Quest stuff, and then this big ensemble heroic quest. Book 2, you have, volume 2, Two Towers, you have 2 sections which run alongside each other. The first being, book 3 is stuff with Aragorn's group, which is the 3 hunters, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, and Merry and Pippin, and what happens to them. Book 4 is Frodo and Sam going off in the other direction, east of the river, to try to get to the Blackland. And so these run alongside each other, they cross over. Occasionally there are things which you realise are also being referenced elsewhere. I think technically, yes, book 4 runs very slightly beyond the start of book 5, which is part of Return of the King. So yes, you have a different structure, and you have 3 parties, inverted commas, because you get in the first section, you get both Aragorn leading the hunters and Merry and Pippin, or particularly Pippin, in some sections, well, in both, I think, the Uruk-hai and in Treebird, possibly, something like that. So in those two chapters. So you have multiple perspectives, multiple points of view. Tolkien, here's just a stylistic point. Tolkien has a really interesting approach to POV and perspective, which indicates, in the best sense, I think, on the whole at least, it's a guy who doesn't know what the rules of fantasy 60, 70 years later will be. And what I mean is, it's kind of third person omniscient, but it's not really, because it's not omniscient. You occasionally get a comment from it is, you get comments from the narrator, you get knowing winks almost, but on the whole you get a close perspective of a particular character. And virtually always that's a hobbit, except when Aragorn and co are hunting Merry and Pippin to liberate them. In that specific instance, you get more or less Aragorn's perspective. And it's interesting because the interior life you get of characters, and even there you don't get much, you mostly get the interior life and perspective and views of hobbits, and when it moves away from there, including even arguably the internal life and perspectives of Smeagol, but when you move away from there, it becomes more general. Hobbits are the audience surrogate. They are humans. Remember, hobbits probably are biologically humans, in fact, or something very close, just like elves are, in fact, which is a kind of weird spectrum to think about. So yeah, you have this thing where he'll dip into perspective and he'll give you, now we're seeing Pippins, now we're seeing almost Aragorns, without getting loads of stuff. The more heroic the character, the less you learn about their interior life from the narrator, the more you have to observe it through the eyes of those who see them. And that's an intentional decision, of course. If you like, this is a loose and intentionally loose reference. It's a bit like one reason why you don't get very much in the way of Bayaz perspectives in the first law. There's a few reasons for it, but one is actually because you're meant to be distant from this character and be kind of unsure what's going on, impressed, intimidated. And yeah, so perspective is interesting, the way he'll dip from third person omniscient into third person pseudo limited, and he uses that a lot across these two sections, and across these three stories, and the fact that you don't always know what's going on. You learn bits and pieces, you're sometimes having to guess or work around the edges. Now, I mentioned in the kind of complete non-spoiler part of this that there is some question about pacing. The most persistent, in the sense of the most continuous, the thing that sticks in terms of criticism of really the whole Lord of the Rings, is not the stuff. One of the most common in one sense is style stuff, and I think that is usually basically just misunderstanding the nature of style, as in it's a taste issue rather than a style issue, if you want to put it that way. Pacing wise, I think there is a partisan group, who would say that the section in book 4, from the Taming of Smeagol to the choice of Master Samwise, is off pace compared to other things that go on in the books, and more so than the comparative section, which is only 3 chapters long, in book 6, i.e. the second half of Return of the King. And I think there's some truth to this. It is the section of the whole of the Lord of the Rings which I think I've, in some sense, struggled with the most, and particularly I'm thinking the first couple of times I read it. I do so less now. And I think it's hard to say exactly what's wrong, and this is very limited criticism, because basically I don't think there's much wrong. I think it's that in comparison it doesn't come across quite as well. You know, see how limited I'm making this. Tolkien is an incredibly pacey writer. It is underappreciated how pacey he is. He writes a 1,000-page book which gets a lot more in, and at a higher speed, and effectively and economically, in a way that other very good authors write 1,000-page books that would accomplish a sixth of what happens in Lord of the Rings. They'd make it a 6-book series at the same kind of page length. And I think that's enormous praise to Tolkien in lots of ways, I should say. It's so dense. There's real conceptual and artistic density. Now, the one time that this shifts is when he moves to a very intimate story of Frodo, Sam and Smeagol going from the Emyn Muil all the way to up into the Black Land, basically trying to get there and then recruiting Gollum, Smeagol to help them, and the relationships of these three and the people they come into contact with, particularly obviously Faramir. If you have seen the films, you'll know of that character too. And because it zeroes down, and it doesn't necessarily covers a longer section of time technically than the previous section in Rohan, but the number of events are fewer, and what's being accomplished is often happening much more at the level of Frodo and Sam's interior life, and that is a slower story. And so partly I don't think it's that there's a technical flaw, oh suddenly this is very badly written. I think it's that it becomes a two-paced book and you have to ride it out, I think. Because I've enjoyed it more and more over time, and the fact that I'm saying this, but other people will say, no, that's my favourite section, I think that's the best paced section, I think that's the most interesting section. It does prove, as do many things here, that Tolkien wrote character excellently, and let's talk about character next. Character is so strong in these books, and you get it's something you get all the way back in the Silmarillion and the Lays. You get it for Turin, I guess. Tuor and Turin, not Tuor and Turin, Hurin and Turin, most obviously. But you get it for other characters, Mim and Beren and Luthien, and other characters like that and Feanor and Maethros and Maglor in the Silmarillion. You get a lot of depth to some characters, but I think it's in the Hobbit stories that you get the deepest character. And not characterization, not just for the hobbits, but particularly for the hobbits. I said this already, but Merry and Pippin have very different voices. Frodo and Sam do. There is something literally about voice, about accent, about the way that characters speak that is not just distinctive, but incredibly well observed. Incredibly well observed. And the way that you see, you see him build this vast cast of characters, both the four hobbits and Smeagol, the fifth hobbit, if you will. I guess Bilbo in the first book as well. But also as you pick up Éomer and Theoden, very slightly Éowyn, she gets a very small part in this book comparatively. She becomes a bit more important in Return of the King. Her part is significantly increased in the film, though she's very important in the book. But I'm talking about hours in the minutes on screen in Two Towers. Arwen is even more, this is even more true of in the films, of course. We get a lot about Saruman, actually. We get a lot about Grima Wormtongue. These characters are very well, and Treebeard, the oldest living creature. You get a lot of depth on these characters. You don't get lots and lots of depth on the orcs you overhear talking. You get a little bit of interesting stuff about the way that orcs think and talk. But you don't get very much on them. You do get, and I think this is such an interesting thing, when we are to understand, and this is a controversial side, but this is the book where it comes up most relevantly, when we are to understand what Tolkien thought about what orcs were, it's good to understand that orcs are creatures of industrial society. They are city folk. If you want to say that Tolkien hated someone, he didn't hate city folk, but he's talking about industrial society. It's why the speech they have when they're talking in common in Rohan, and when they're overheard and understood in the Black Land, they speak with urban accents, London accents in essence, or maybe urban Oxford accents. Whereas the one time in the entire trilogy, really, where you see a person from a non-European culture or country up close, it is Sam looking at a Haradrim, and considering that this chap had obviously been lied to and dragged from home to a faraway war that he probably had no interest in, and is a victim of it, just like Sam is, I guess, in essence. There's a vast cast who's really well characterised. The writing, the style continues to be beautiful. I think he's a beautiful writer, and the poems and songs constantly, joyful presence. There's some excellent lines and passages, very famous ones, of course. I love not the sword for its swiftness, nor the other sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the something for its something, but for that which they defend, which is Faramir. In the film, they cut the third section of that comparison. Now, let's see if I can actually get it up here. One interesting thing is how many stories you hear about the First Age. It really is, continuous in terms of how much he is telling you about the world behind it. Just on the world building tangent, the world building is so deep and continuous and integrated. For instance, a really beautiful moment is when Frodo, in a very bad, dark place, sees a defaced and destroyed head of a statue of a Gondorian or Númenorian king, and sees it's crowned with flowers in this dark place, and these flowers are very beautiful, and the sun is shining on it just at sunset, and there's something there. Pathetic fallacy, the whole thing, the world is full of pathetic fallacy because it's not fallacy, really. Nature does reflect reality, moral reality. But he sees this, and all these things combine: the style, the description, but also the actual historical content, the symbol, the fact it's defaced, but the fact it's recrowned. All these things combine, layered together, which is just very, very effective. Let's see if where is this thing? This is well, it doesn't matter that much, does it? But I think there is so much in the characterization and so many different characters. You'll always find someone to like and engage with, and the moral seriousness with which it treats characters and the depth with which Tolkien treats characters is, we would say, and this is actually unfair on classic sci-fi and fantasy, but we would say it's ahead of its time. One reason we think that is actually often because stylistic differences alienate us in a way that is chiefly about our levels of experience and comfort rather than the reality. Old books often have deep characters, not always. There is definitely true that the psychologically intense thing is a modern thing, but Lord of the Rings, I think, transcends it, partly because it bridges a gap towards things we expect about characters' interior life. It's interesting, and I don't want to go on about adaptation. I should really make videos about how the books are adapted. But I think something you see Peter Jackson do is try to heighten as many of those emotional contrasts and emotional revelations as possible. And he draws on stuff that's really in the books. It's not just invented whole cloth. There are things, I gave the example with Fellowship, where Aragorn doubts himself in the film about everything, and in the book he doesn't doubt the fact that he's the heir of Elendil, whereas he does seem to. He's implied to in the book. He's implied to in the film, sorry. But in the book he does doubt himself. Can he lead the party? Can he make wise decisions? He constantly doubts himself from Moria onwards. So it's a real thing where Aragorn is coming to terms with the idea of becoming a leader. It is there in Tolkien, but Jackson draws it out. And I think what you see sometimes is either Jackson is drawing stuff out, or occasionally is offering an alternate reality, an alternate way that Tolkien could have written a particular section or character. And I think that's really interesting to look at, partly because it helps us understand how Tolkien wrote those characters. Adaptation is always commentary as well. And I think, I'd certainly say with Two Towers, there are things where you can see some characters shifting or changing, and some, but you can see that what Jackson does in terms of drawing out deeper, and by that I mean in our terms deeper characters, he's always drawing on things that are there. He's always finding inspiration in Tolkien. He's never saying Tolkien, hey, this guy's not very good at his job, is he? Remember, though he's incredibly programmatically important, really the only major character cut by Jackson is Tom Bombadil. And that's basically a film cinematic pace and cinematic style issue. He generally keeps the major characters and he takes their central beats from the books, and it shows how deep that work is. Anything else to say about world building? Well, we get to see lots of other countries here. We get to see, and that gives Tolkien the chance to talk about nature and the world. Here's the thing, to go back to the pacing question. They're both pacing and style issues, like writing style. People correctly pick up on the fact that Tolkien spends a page and a half or 2 pages on a battle, and several pages on describing a place and the conversations that our characters have about that place and learning about the background of that place. And I think an interesting revelation is to realize that when we complain about that, we indicate naturally our preferences, what we enjoy, but we can, when we come to something so serious and dense as the Lord of the Rings, if we want to work out what's going on, there has to be a degree of us being like, what does the author care about? Why has the author done this? Not just in an intellectual sense, but emotionally. Why does Tolkien write so little about war in terms of the action of war, despite the fact that this book has a massive war in it? And why does he write so much about nature and about history and about what people hope to do in the future? Well, it turns out that when you're and there's literally a place called No Man's Land in this. This is a guy who's at war, who lost friends in war, and came away from it with a very different perspective on it to the war poets who kind of mocked and derided it and despaired about it. Tolkien doesn't do that. He instead says, "I love not the sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, but for those which they defend, or for that which they defend." Like he takes a view of war which is not catastrophic in that sense, except that sometimes, yes, war does destroy precious things and unjust things happen. Men are dragged far from home to fight for an evil cause, and he is therefore interested in dwelling on the reasons why we do things, the reasons why these things matter, the fact that we can make a more beautiful world, the fact that we can have a better world or we can have a worse world, that we have things to look forward to in the future. It's something where I think if this was a much more stylized and funky book, where there is this background but a lot of a war, but a lot more of it is explicitly cast in modern stylistic terms, is about characters sitting around talking about the things they care about, and you'd have people being like, man, be a Guy Gavriel Kay kind of thing. My impression is, be like, oh man, look at the style here, look at the funk, look at the kind of depth and intellect. Whereas with Tolkien, we may end up being like, oh, it's a book about a war, but there's virtually no war in it. They're just talking about flowers. It's because the flowers matter, not the killing. The killing only happens because someone wants to destroy the flowers. And yeah, I think that's something we have to appreciate if we're going to appreciate Tolkien, especially in the book which has the Battle of Helm's Deep, and where you see a lot of and there is plenty of action in that, but it's not like it's a long section. What happens at Helm's Deep is as much about the discussions between characters and friendships and about the politics of the moment and about the kind of what's going on, as it is about the battle. The battle compared to, again, this is the comparison to the film, what does Jackson take out? The cinematic thing, the battle, whereas you get a very lengthy description from Gimli of, not first hand, but second hand, of him being like, let me tell you about these caves, Legolas, they're amazing, let me tell you about these caves. And him and Legolas's friendship being explored via that, the world being explored via that, and Gimli's personality and character, and partly what has happened to him, both what already was the case and what's happened to him since meeting Galadriel. Ithilien, similarly, is a really beautiful, especially at the moment where they almost call it, they call it a false peace. This moment before, things are going to kick off in the next book, and they're going through this beautiful countryside so close to the enemy, is really powerful and poignant, actually quite emotionally affecting in moments which aren't about, well, it's not that people are saying, let me tell you what's emotionally affecting, but just they're talking about the world. The character work and relationships, as I said, the character work is great, the relationships are great. Sam and Frodo and Smeagol is really interesting and powerfully put together, and perhaps even more is seeing Merry and Pippin come into their own and deal with all those things, seeing what happens with the three hunters and Rohan and this new cast of characters. So what have we talked about? We've talked about style, we've talked about pacing, we've talked about the world building, we've talked about I suppose, generally speaking, the story. He does very well at presenting big political stakes, I think, as well as these personal, private stakes, not just for characters specifically, but for the whole subplot of the ring bearers heading east. but yeah, he definitely does draw quickly this political world, often in fairly few lines, in a very poetic way, which again is something which lots of authors who want to write politics into their world could learn from. We can all learn from. Yeah, that is what I think about The Two Towers. I think personally, it's still a virtually perfect book. It's a great book. It is a tiny step below Fellowship for me, and I think it's because of the two-pace issue, the fact that as he splits the party and has divergent chronologies and types of story, as I say, with Frodo and Sam having this intimate quest story, and the three hunters and the other hobbits having a what becomes much more of a political military story. Really, there are quest story elements, but because the quest is the political military stuff, it kind of merges in with that. I think that section is at such pace and with such variety, whereas you have to deal with a much more concentrated, intimate picture, and I think that creates a very slight issue. But I think that's lessened for me over time as I've been willing to be patient and just accept the terms which Tolkien is dictating. I think the books leave. It's interesting where the books end, and this will be a very minor kind of, or relatively minor, not very minor, relatively minor spoiler for The Two Towers as a whole. But one section ending with some characters turning south to go to Minas Tirith ahead of the other good guys, and then the other bit being the chapter called The Choices of Master Samwise. I think it's interesting to see where they end, in the same way that it's interesting to see that Fellowship ends with Frodo and Sam leaving. It doesn't end as the film does. It doesn't end also with stuff around Boromir, but it ends with them leaving, and then the second book starts with Boromir, understanding that the second book ends essentially later into the story than the films do, and that it leaves it in a position where you have essentially the crack of doom happening in both stories. Getting close to the moment of decision, I think, is a very interesting and intelligent decision. And I don't know how far that was enforced editorially, and how far it was Tolkien thought, no, that was a good place to break. Anyway, that is my discussion, my review of Two Towers. What do you think of it? What are your favourite bits? What are your least favourite bits? What flaws and strengths do you think it has? Feel free to comment on Adaptation, because I think it is very rarely has a set of books been so magisterially interpreted in Adaptation as the Lord of the Rings films, and so it's a natural place to talk about the way we understand the books is via the way they were then put onto screen. Anyway, all of that in the comments. Till next time.